And now it's time for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. And this week, like everybody who was an insider in Wisconsin politics, we're mourning the loss of Governor Tony Earl. Chuck, you had the chance to actually come into politics just as Tony Earl was becoming governor of the state of Wisconsin. What are your reflections on his legacy?
He was a kind and generous man, and he was probably from that kind of dying era of bipartisanship. He was good to everyone, Republican or Democrat. There was much more bipartisanship. I came into the assembly when Governor Earl took office, and they did call him Tony, and he was popular. He was, in my view, the last progressive governor we've had since Governor Evers has taken office. And he was very popular with people, but he accomplished a number of things, even though he faced terribly difficult economic times. Acid rain legislation, groundwater legislation, maintained funding for the University of Wisconsin in a very difficult time. Let me tell you a story about Governor Earl. He put into his budget, he did not have to do this, but in the 1980s, he put into his budget a provision, and I think it was his second budget, that allowed for a person who was going to be a gay liaison, a liaison with the gay community in his budget. That was voted down, to give you an idea how times have changed. That was voted down 15-1 in the Joint Finance Committee. I was a member of the committee at that time. There was only one vote in favor of that. And a profile encouraged, besides Governor Earl, with Joe Stroll. A shout out to him, because at a time when no one was willing to take these issues on, when Governor Earl, I know, got calls from like the publisher of the Wisconsin State Journal, Governor Earl put that forward, and I think it shows the kind of forward-looking, thoughtful, caring person he was. He was not going to put anyone outside of society, and he specifically did that. I remember asking the staff, said, you can do this. Why did you have to specifically name it? So because we had to name it. It was the right thing to do, and we were going to do it. I was very pleased to see that, but I think that is indicative of the entire way that Tony Earl ran his office. He was a good man, a kind man to all people.
You know, I find it interesting that so many of the tributes here since his death have used the same words to describe the man, that he was kind, that he was a good man, that he was willing to do what he thought was right, regardless of the political consequences, which he did a number of times. Indeed, that's part of the reason he probably was a one-term governor, was that he made some bold decisions that he thought were right for Wisconsin, and the voters were not yet ready to accept those things. He was even kind to me and my family. So I started my career in politics in Wisconsin. I was hired to oppose his agenda, and yet later on, he and I worked together on issues, including a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin back when those things were bipartisan. My wife worked with him, and they became very good friends. And every time I would see the governor, he would ask about my wife. I mean, this is a guy who people generally liked to be with. He didn't necessarily, he used that, I think, in some ways to try to accomplish things in politics that he thought were right for other people, another form of kindness. And yet I think that is part of the reason that he was a one-term governor of the state. He was ahead of where the voters were at the time.
In fact, and Scott, I think those are really great words, and I appreciate your being willing to do this for Governor Earl. But I also want to point out that he was so much so that kind and generous man that as he went through, he would make decisions that were not necessarily in his political interest. And by the way, he was the last governor who did not use polling before he ran for office. Everything these days, people will tell you at the national level, you hear a phrase and you hear it again and again and again. That's because of the polling, ladies and gentlemen. And we all do it, even at the state Senate level, state assembly level. Governor Earl was the last of an era. He did what he thought was right. He did what he thought the people would want. He's to be honored. He's one of the last of a generation. He was a great man.
He was also a very funny man. I think he had a great sense of humor. And he was also a great host. He was, nowadays, it's pretty rare for legislators to just stop by the executive residence to have a beer with the governor. but that was a common thing to play cards or have a beer with Governor Earl. And I think it's part of the reason that people really miss him and miss that sort of politics in Wisconsin.
The open beer tap at Governor Earl's residence was well known among legislators and much beloved. But we really honor him. He is the last of an era, and thank goodness that Wisconsin had him. He was definitely one for the ages. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategy.